Thank you, Scott. That was incredibly informative. It gives you a sense on a higher level of, and probably a sort of statistically heavy but important level in terms of what a platform trial looks like in general. There are a few people who have as much experience with platform trials as Scott, so it's really phenomenal to have him in this discussion. So I will, if I can figure out how to make this move. It isn't wanting to move. There we go. So I will now give you a sense of what the current, we're calling this, or I'm calling this, Release 1.0, of the proposed platform trial for Duchenne looks like. And as you've heard multiple times this morning, this is an initial pass. It's been a couple of years in the making. I mean, obviously these discussions have been championed, but going on for quite some time. This reflects input from really all stakeholders, at least in this first pass. And I'll actually give you a sense of where things stand as we go through this. So given the fact that not everybody in here is, a clinical trial wonk, I'm going to start sort of with, what is a protocol? A protocol is a large document, a very detailed recipe. It goes through all elements of a clinical trial, goes through the objectives, the design, the methodology, all of the statistical a number of the statistical considerations, and that's relevant, and I'll get back to that later. And how is this organized? It needs to comply with all sorts of regulations set forth by our federal government. There are global considerations as well. GCP stands for Good Clinical Practices. This is a standard to which we are all held, frankly, globally, in terms of how it is appropriate to do any form of research with human beings. And obviously, it complies with federal regulations set forth by the FDA. So as you've been hearing, as you can imagine, this is a disruptive, really tremendous, fairly audacious undertaking. But it is, the opportunity to be able to evaluate multiple interventions in this single entity is incredibly compelling in it, and it is clearly the appropriate motivation. Because we're going to be evaluating or creating this platform to evaluate multiple interventions, it really does require compromises to be able, as Scott mentioned, we need to have multiple types of endpoints to be able to include children as young as 5 with older young men who might be 25. Their functional capacities obviously are so varied that this does require including endpoints that may be irrelevant for some of the participants, but are going to be critical for others. The opportunity to have an adaptive design, so it really does allow for flexibility over time, is very meaningful. And as you learned earlier, and I think that Dr. Dunn spoke so compellingly about, the fact that this is a living entity, it will necessarily evolve over time. So this is an initial look at where we may end up starting. And by the way, I say we may end up starting because we still need input from all of you, from the people on the phone, from, the point of this discussion is to get your feedback now. And this is a starting place. But once we solidify that start, there are going to be other iterations as we learn. Okay, so this initial draft that you're seeing this morning, it has been compiled by input from FDA, from multiple clinicians, from multiple You know, I started this collaboration when I was wearing my chief medical officer hat for a different company. We spent a year having regular conversations and meetings about moving this forward with multiple companies and a lot of advocacy representatives. We are in the process of getting in some additional scientific review from a broader group of clinicians and also a number of the clinicians who we've been working with but who now have the full document to dig into. So we're getting that feedback now. There is a steering committee in formation that I'll get into, but that is, again, a multi-stakeholder steering committee of clinician scientists and patients and advocates that will ultimately come to consensus on the final protocol for this initial release. So what are the objectives of the trial? Because all trials have to have objectives. It's, as you've heard this again and again this morning, to evaluate the efficacy and safety of multiple interventions in parallel, simultaneously, and to explore the effect of those interventions over time. In addition, we'll be looking at health-related quality of life associated with these interventions. Those are the secondary endpoint, primarily because, as we all know, there are not yet ideal quality of life measures to use. Let me back up. So again, this mirrors, and I think it is probably, it's not by accident that some of this information is duplicative, that you've recently heard it, only because we've all had to hear it multiple times to get our heads around this concept of a platform trial. So as you heard from Scott, this is a perpetual, meaning it's ongoing, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-arm platform trial, targeting probably phase 2, phase 2/3, phase 3, and I would argue phase 4 trials, those that it could be appropriate for. Eligible patients, no, I don't have a clicker, but so the first step is to be eligible for the platform trial itself, and I'll go through those eligibility criteria, at least as they're currently proposed. And then there would be, if a patient obviously decides to participate, randomization equally to any one of the arms. And as you know, that the number of arms would change over time. Then once a patient is randomized to an arm, within that arm, they get randomized, ideally 3 to 1, to the investigational agent or to placebo. The primary endpoint for an appendix, so for one of those intervention arms, is actually going to be selected. That'll be defined in the appendix by whoever the sponsor of that investigational agent is. They'll be able to choose from the list of endpoints that I'll be going through. There is the opportunity to have an open label extension in the platform, and obviously this is something that we would be encouraged, but it's going to be at the discretion of the sponsors. Keep doing that. Ah, man, okay. So as you heard from Scott, patients who are in an arm that's either been discontinued or completed will have the opportunity, once whatever their intervention had been washes out, if they choose, they can be re-randomized into another arm. Arms may, oh, I should also mention that this is getting sorted out, but one of the intentions of the platform is that if you've been on placebo, if you were randomized to placebo for your first trial, that you would not be randomized to placebo for the second. New treatment arms, as you know, may be included at any point within the platform. The test product, the investigational agent, the dose, the mode of administration, all of that is going to be defined within the appendix protocol, within within what we're calling an ARM protocol. So that is a separate, very detailed document. And the duration of the treatment, the duration of the study, is going to be specific to each appendix protocol, because some of it, some of them will make sense for them to be longer, some of them will make sense for them to be a little bit shorter. So again, as you've been hearing a lot this morning, the purpose of the platform is to be able to evaluate a very broad group of patients. Overall, we'll be enrolling non-ambulant and ambulant boys and young men with Duchenne. What you'll note from the eligibility criteria is, in order to be able to enroll a pretty wide number of patients, they're about as simple as we can get. So the inclusion criteria at the moment are literally these three. That patients would have to be ambulant or non-ambulant. They have to be at least 5 years old. And they have to have a documented diagnosis of Duchenne. They have to have the ability to provide reliable and reproducible, repeatable FVC, so be able to actually perform pulmonary function testing within a certain parameter or framework. There's a little bit of discussion around, is it 10%, is it 15%, but that gives you the gist. It would be repeated baseline and screening. And obviously that either they or their legal guardians consent to their participation. The exclusion criteria are, probably not surprisingly, a little bit more complex. The first chunk speak to wanting to make sure that any participants would be sort of on a steady state of whatever their disease-modifying therapies are. So either a change in their dose or new steroids. You have to have been on a stable dose for 6 months. The same goes for growth hormone or androgens. Translarna or Exondys 51 would have to have been part of the therapeutic regimen for at least a year. And they can't have been treated with an investigational product within 30 days or 5 half-lives prior to randomization. For obvious reasons, you don't want somebody who is going to be having a large planned surgery in 3 months to be starting a clinical trial. So there too, if there's a known reason for surgery, they would have to hold off. No, come on. Okay. These next set of criteria speak to wanting to make sure that patients, that the disease severity is not so extreme that actually they would be put at risk by potentially put at risk by participating in the trial. So respiratory insufficiency as defined by a certain threshold of their forced vital capacity, a recent respiratory illness within 30 days that required treatment, and there'll be more explicit, what defines treatment will be more explicitly clarified. Reduction in the heart muscle function, the ejection fraction of less than 35% within a certain framework or certain time frame prior to randomization. Any other clinically significant disease unrelated to DMD that might put that participant at risk for participating in the trial. And again, other unstable medical or behavioral issues that might make it challenging for them to participate in the trial. In addition, obviously, if a patient say we have 3 ongoing arms, appendix arms in the platform, and each one has a exclusion criterion specific to that type of an intervention. If that patient were to meet an exclusion criterion for all of the currently enrolling arms they wouldn't be eligible at that point in time for the platform. But again, it's ARMS will come in, so it will continue to evolve. Okay, so the endpoints that we are looking at, and again, this has to be a little bit of a sweet spot. There's been, as you can imagine, a lot of discussion about these. And I suspect there'll be a lot of discussion in the question answer and the panels about them as well. But the trick is to have the fewest number of assessments, to minimize burden, minimize cost, but to identify those where they will give us the best possible, the most sensitive and specific markers of change in disease severity over time in a very broad population. So the lower limb function tests include the North Star 100-meter walk test and 4-stair climb. There have been, well, I won't anticipate the discussion, but look forward to it. In terms of the upper limb function testing, it will include the PUL 2.0 and the Brook upper extremity scale. Spirometry, pulmonary function testing will be included, the key metrics, and again, there will be obviously a host of other variables, a host of other assessments that will be being done, histories and physicals that are very specific to disease progression. Certain milestone, history that identifies milestones in respiratory function over time. But the key parameters in terms of the spirometry that will be being followed are FVC, PEF, and FEV1. In cardiac imaging, that actually is supposed to have two things there. It's actually echo and MRI. That's a typo, sorry about that. For quality of life, we have included the PODC. And I'm sure actually there'll be plenty of discussion about what is not included for a variety of those different types of assessments. Okay, so all endpoints are going to get collected in the same order. So there will be standardization. I mean, this is one of the efficiencies in terms of doing a platform trial. Right now, where the coordinators and the physical therapists at sites are juggling 8, 10 trials, each one with slightly nuanced differences in terms of how they're supposed to be collecting each of the different functional assessments. So there'll be standardization of both how you collect the functional assessments and the order in which they're collected across all of the trials, all of the appendices. And each of the appendix protocols will be able to identify which of those core endpoints that you saw will be their primary endpoint and which ones will be their secondary endpoints. In terms of safety assessments, and these are pretty straightforward, these are pretty standard safety assessments. And so these will be the core ones. Again, a appendix protocol can obviously and should be adding any sort of intervention-specific additional safety assessments as necessary. But the core safety assessments are tracking adverse events, specifically serious adverse events, following physical examinations, and doing routine clinical lab testing over time. The endpoints, so like the key ones of those assessments that will be being tracked for safety endpoints are the AEs and the serious adverse events, and specifically laboratory abnormalities. Now, in terms of the frequency of visits, and again, this is creating about as broad a proposed set of follow-up time points as possible. But if for instance, a particular type of intervention, because of safety reasons, needs closer follow-up than this early on, say, obviously those time points can get added. This is the minimum number of time points, particularly for the efficacy and the safety endpoints. So that, again, all of the control patients, would actually have the exact same time points, so we'll be able to compare apples to apples. But as you see, in the first year, and again, this goes out to 24 months, and for some interventions that will be appropriate and relevant, there will be flexibility for those where it isn't, to be able to have shorter follow-up. But optimally, as much follow-up as possible, so that the control patients, again, have a similar amount of follow-up assessments, the better. So for the first year, the follow-up is every 3 months. For the second year, every 6 months. Okay, so you've also heard a little bit about how challenging the sort of constitution of setting something like this up is, and the governance. So the steering committee, which is in formation at this point, is going to review the compilation of the scientific reviews and input that's been coming in over the last several weeks. Also input from those in the room, from those on the phone, from, essentially anybody who's going to reach out about this. And a final draft will be developed, which will then go to the FDA this fall for a deeper dive in terms of, so they actually have now a document to review. And obviously, then their input will be critical to finalizing this initial draft of the platform trial protocol. We do expect, as you've heard again multiple times this morning, that this will change over time. Scott mentioned already the fact that over time, once there is a larger group of patients already participating in the platform, it will then be easier or appropriate to include gene targeting therapies into the platform. At this point, we're not going to do that. I think we all envision a time when we will be able to include boys who are younger than 5 years old, and likely evolve other eligibility criteria as well. Other novel endpoints may be appropriate at a later date to also include as more information about them becomes available. This thing does not like me. Okay. So just to touch a little bit also on some important related issues, because you've heard a little bit this morning about data sharing. And it is one of the wonderful things about a platform. The control data is used across all of the arms. It is also important to note that the treatment arm data is proprietary. That's proprietary to whichever industrial collaborator partner owns it. And that really has to be sacrosanct. So for instance, Dr. Dunn was speaking about the fact that there's this beauty in the standardization and a shared IRB, Data and Safety Monitoring Board, et cetera, et cetera. There will be shared discussions with the FDA, but each company has to have their own proprietary time to be able to deal with their data confidentially with the FDA. There will be, however, a single data monitoring committee, adjudication committees. There will be, actually, we hadn't yet discussed the IRB issue, but we will be, and obviously there is efficiencies and not only efficiencies, but power in terms of being able to have the broader context for all of those oversight committees. And I think I'm going to pause there where I think we're really behind. So rather, we're going to let Abby drive. Abby should definitely drive. Do you want this?
No, stay up here.
Okay.
So we are running late, but because we have Dr. Dunn still here and we have Scott and Deborah, we want to take 5 burning questions. And we have mics, so just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. And then after the 5 burning questions, we'll take a small break and try to get right back on time with panel 1. So, any questions?
Therapeutics.
Can you say your name again? I don't think I might.
Francesco Bibbiani, I work for PTC Therapeutics. So far we have talked about patients in general, but we all know that DMD does not have a linear decline. So there will be patients that in the same amount of time, they will be pretty much stable, or they will decline very fast. So how is that taken into consideration when we talk about numbers?
So you don't, that's fine, you don't need linearity of that. And part of the analysis, if you saw my graphs of that, is we'll be able to measure, time is the linear part of this. If a patient on placebo declines from one status to another, does the drug slow that rate of decline? That's the parameter we're interested within that. That can be measured across multiple endpoints where you might be declining on some measures and you're declining less on others. And we've built that for the upper limb and the North Star. So somebody who has no ambulation is still contributing statistically to the upper limb the same that somebody may be losing ambulation. So that, despite the fact that there's no change in ambulation for that individual patient, we're getting it on a different endpoint where they are declining on that particular endpoint.
How about the 5-year-olds that will not decline for years?
Well, so that Deborah brought that up, and that's why it's initially the line is drawn for 5. And of course, the way that patient is declining, even though absolutely they're increasing. They're declining relative to normative patients. And the first mom who came up here and talked about that her child was falling behind the curve, we have to be able to analyze that that individual 3-year-old, 4-year-old is falling behind normative, and they're declining at a rate, even though their absolute numbers are increasing, it's not increasing as fast as they should. So that's how we're going to move into the left part of that to include those patients. They're probably the patients that actually are more likely to respond to drugs at the earliest time point. So that's what we're moving into the left part, the earlier stage.
So I'm sure you've addressed this issue in your meetings, but looking at how initially the treatment protocols will be, it'll be probably broad therapeutics that apply to the patients. And I'm wondering, at what point do you include manifesting carriers and females in your study protocols?
So that's a great question. We have touched on it briefly, and suffice it to say, not yet, because I think clearly we need to have a platform that is up and running for at this point the boys and Duchenne patients that are most affected. Once that's up and running, and we've got a number of trials going, then it's time to start readdressing those types of, we sort of have a list of, accruing list of those types of additional patients that are really important to flesh out the understanding across the full population. So that's a little bit of a non-answer, sorry.
Just a reminder, say your name when you stand up for your question. Hi, Jody Wolf from Santhera. Two quick questions. Scott, in order for your movie to work with the trials, all those patients have to be in the same stage of disease, right? Like they all either, you have to have 3 trials that are going on in non-ambulatory boys, or you have to have 3 trials that are going on in ambulatory boys. You can't actually cross those, can you? And my second question is, you said this is most appropriate for phase 2 and 3. Can you do post-marketing studies with this? And will there be restrictions on that when you start the trial?
So I think you understand this, but I want to jump back to this. Almost the terminology of different companies running different trials, running a trial in non-ambulatory. This is one trial. When an arm comes into this, they're going to share the same patient population. You can't, as a company, come in and say, I want boys only 6 and 7. Now, and companies do that because those are maybe the boys that are most likely to decline on a particular endpoint in that setting. So all the arms will come in with the same inclusion-exclusion criteria, and they will all contribute to understanding whether that drug slows the rate of decline. If there's a scenario where arms have different exclusion criteria for safety reasons, and a patient could not be randomized to that arm, that patient will not be used by that arm. So yes, we will compare apples to apples across there. So A won't be loaned a placebo that wouldn't be eligible for A in that setting. Now, the data's there, and we're going to analyze, do they have different outcomes? And that'll be done, and that data's available. But it's not going to be wide, separate inclusion criteria for the different appendices or sub-studies within that. Especially initially.
Abby, I know we were doing a short question answer. We have 2 more questions. Can we do both questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to just answer about phase 4?
Oh, phase 4. So absolutely post-marketing, absolutely. Hopefully it's open label extension into that, but there's absolutely no reason why post-market studies couldn't be done within this as well.
So Craig McDonald from University of California. With regard to this issue of re-randomization not to placebo, I hadn't really thought about this, but obviously it's heart-wrenching for a patient and their family to be randomized consecutively to the placebo arm in 2 trials. I completely understand the rationale for that, but a sense, in most situations, at some point the patient participating in one independent trial is at least informed of what their treatment allocation was in that trial. They're informed of whether they were on the placebo group or the active treatment group. In this instance, you really couldn't inform that participant as to what their allocation was in the previous trial, in order to, I think, maintain the scientific integrity of the trial sort of moving forward. So I'm just curious about that, and also obviously then if you have patients that are then re-randomized only to the active treatment arm and they've already been on an active treatment, there's multiple reasons why trials may fail or sponsors may discontinue their drug development and so forth. They don't hit statistical significance, and so the question is, there's obviously a standard time for washout, but that might put some inherent biases in for patients who then get randomized only to active treatment arms who were previously on perhaps active treatment and so forth. Well, that could introduce some inherent biases. So I'm just curious about your comments on that. I think most importantly in terms of the informing the patient what treatment allocation they were previously on.
So just quickly, I think that patients that are on something that's successful, they may all move into the open label extension. So we're thinking about arms that are unsuccessful and now they're moving on to a separate one. It could be done even blinded as to what you were on before. If they're informed of their status, they could be informed of that status moving forward. If not, the randomization could be held because it's within the same master protocol. We had a great deal of discussion of there's a benefit if we re-randomized everybody scientifically, that patient moving forward is still blinded to what they were on. We compared that to the patient experience of potentially going on to placebos, and we decided to dump it in Dr. Dunn's lap, that we would rather have that individual be unblinded and know they're on active, and that would be part of the analysis. He can speak to that, but it was the pluses and minuses of that for the patient experience within this outweighed the slight negative to that patient actually being unblinded and knowing they're on active in their second particular appendix.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. That caught my ear as well, and I think it's one of the things that really jumped out at me, Scott, in your presentation. So I applaud you for bringing it up. I think it can be summarized much more, briefly as saying that whatever you do, we're going to need to talk about it carefully because practical and kind of participatory considerations are important, but they can't violate the integrity of any given trial, otherwise we're undermining the entire effort. So I certainly appreciate the dynamics involved, and you want to maintain an enthusiasm for recruitment and participation. But if we're going to do this right, we need to make sure that everything is rigorous and fully interpretable, and there's a pretty bright light on that comment that you made about how you're going to handle that. So we'll need to look at that very carefully. The other thing that I would mention is that I mentioned this kind of briefly in my comments, but as we set this up, I really hope that a platform trial like this, which becomes part and parcel of how we're doing business and is welcoming and well understood, I hope that it returns an awareness of the concept of equipoise, to everybody involved, because as we depart from that, it makes trials difficult, and as we embrace that, it makes trials more feasible. And it's not to say that we don't want people to get placebo, but we also don't know if drugs are effective before they've been tested. And we have to kind of balance those issues. And what we really want is we want to have an understandable, interpretable result from each one of these aspects of the trial. So there's a lot of moving parts there, and I hope that the presence of a platform trial will help address some of that, that top line resistance to participating in a trial at all because of the fear of getting a placebo when we realize that there's a bigger machine testing many entities here. And so I hope that helps recruit and encourage participation and encourage that sense of commitment to advancing our treatments in this field independent of the specific placebo issue. That's my hope.
We have time for one more.
Steve Hauschka, University of Washington, Seattle. I have a question about the proprietary information aspect, so maybe it's for Deborah. Those of us involved in basic research are often negatively impeded by delayed proprietary information issues, where companies understandably don't want to release sad information about their particular trial. But those of us who are doing basic research in these treatments often are confronted by review committees that say that trial is ongoing. We won't fund this new research until we know about those results. So how can this trial be set up so that the information that is proprietary is released perhaps before a 24-month finalization of collecting things, especially when it's negative to the scientific, at least the scientific community, in a way that hopefully wouldn't hurt the companies.
Yeah. So in terms of the proprietary information, there can be, policies put in place that encourage getting that data out there as soon as possible. But frankly, the treatment arm data really will be owned by the companies. So it's still going to be within their within their purview to make their decisions about when they'll be releasing it. There'll be a shared publications committee. In the beginning, all of that will fall within the steering committee's purview. But you can imagine over time that will become, assuming that this initiative gets the legs it should, they will be very busy committees. So there'll be publications, separate publications committee, and et cetera, et cetera. And obviously they'll each have their own charters. There'll certainly be different constraints put on data sharing for the control arm data, and that's one of the beautiful things about it. And there'll be tremendous strength in that, particularly over time when there's more and more of it. But in terms of the treatment arm data, that really, I think to make this work, really, at least unless I'm having trouble envisioning, a really new world, I don't envision that necessarily changing. It's going to be up to the companies to decide when to release that data.
Yeah, let me jump in on that.
Oh, good.
Let me come up here for this one. Where did you go? There he is. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me jump in on that because I mentioned during my comments that data sharing in the field is a passion of mine. I work very carefully on this. And I think this is exactly where I think the presence of the Critical Path Institute is crucial to the overall success of this. You already have a group involved in this, in addition to the FDA, who's going to work side by side with this effort, that understands data sharing issues and works very closely with sponsors on this. I share your concern about access to data that furthers research, but the community as a whole wants to do this as well. And I think it's increasingly becoming recognized that good scientific citizenship is an important aspect of the conduct of trials. It's extremely unlikely. Every major company has data transparency and sharing provisions of their own. You just got to go to their page to see this stuff. They have internal initiatives to do this. But we also have a neuroscience data sharing initiative, and I certainly, through this Critical Path Institute that I work on, and I certainly assure you that this type of an effort with many commercial entities participating as well as a variety of other invested parties would be included in that effort. We would be, for the data sharing component, in addition to internal platform issues, we would be working with Jane and her, where's Jane? Are you still down there? Yeah, we'd be working with her colleagues at the DRSC to ensure that the data from this were folded in as rapidly as possible. We have to protect the integrity of the trial. We have to respect commercial issues, but again, there's a recognition that pre-competitive data sharing furthers competitive goals that companies have. I think this is no longer novel, and it's kind of becoming part of good scientific citizenship. So our neuroscience data sharing initiative that we're working on will help a lot with that, and I think that the data sharing structure that exists will be very receptive to bringing these data to bear. We work on identifying early opportunities for control groups. When do we bring the active data in? Do we clean it? Do we aggregate it? Is it done in proper fashion for subsequent use with industry? I wanted to come back to something that Scott said too. Scott said when we give it to CPATH so they can analyze it. I wanted to clarify that. We don't just give it to CPATH. Okay, what happens is CPATH is a repository for this information that's then available to you. Okay, through data agreements. Each contributor of the data can authorize different tiers of access, but it's available to the agency. It is available to CPATH scientists. It's available to other developers. It's available to academicians, to individual scientists. It furthers the field as a whole. So this is a critical component of what this can offer. And I kind of talked about that briefly in my comments, but it will be a very high-profile topic, and I'm really glad you asked.